are here in person and those who are connecting online. We have people online whom we are equally glad to have with us as part of this conversation. My name is Macarena Gallardo. I am the head of membership and integrity here at AHK Chile, and it's a pleasure to open this session. Before we begin, I would like to mention that this presentation will be recorded, and we would greatly appreciate if you could take 1 minute at the end of the session to respond a short feedback survey. Very, very, very important. Well, the EU-MERCOSUR Agreement is highly relevant development for many of our member companies, and it has the potential to shape future trade conditions, regulatory alignments, and cooperation frameworks between Europe and Latin America, creating new opportunities for collaboration, investment, and stronger value chains across both regions. I would like also to warmly highlight the collaboration with Heidelberg Center Latin America and to thank our distinguished speakers, Professor Dr. Mark Philip Beller from Heidelberg University and Andrea, is it Nicola or Nikolai or?
Nikolai.
Nikolai, Policy Officer of the Delegation of the European Union to Chile, for contributing their expertise and time and perspective to today's discussion. We especially encourage both of our participants here in the room and those joining us online to take advantage of the discussion segment and at the end of the session as an open space for exchange. It's very important that we have a very organic conversation for us. So feel free to ask. I think nobody would have a worse English than me, so. And your questions and perspective are very welcome and will help enrich today's conversation. Thank you very much. And Dr. Beck, Dr. Professor. No, Professor Beck, sorry.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here again. I remember last year we had a wonderful reception here at the discourse about corporate sustainability. And this time we will discuss about the MERCOSUR trade agreement. And it's a great honor for us to have Andrea Nicolai, who negotiated this agreement. So he is the real expert, but we from Heidelberg will have the pleasure to give an overview about it and then go in more details afterwards. I would like to present you my two colleagues from Heidelberg, Mariana Denner and Rebecca Reiser. We will share the presentation. We divided it in 3 little parts to give an overview. And I would also like to mention my 2 esteemed directors of the Heidelberg Center Latin America, Ines Recio and Daniel Eckenfels. Perhaps you can just, perfect. They organized my visit here to Chile. The MERCOSUR EU trade agreement. Well, it's one of the big free trade agreements worldwide. And we would like to look first what are general aspects of such free trade agreements, then have a closer look to the content, some special legal issues, and at the end of our first introduction, the gains and the losses of this agreement. We will see it benefits largely to both sides. Free trade agreements. Well, you know, the European Union is a great success. And it is a success because it's founded on the economic freedoms. It started in 1958 with the Treaties of Rome. And today, of course, we are discussing about human rights and common political foreign policy. But at the very heart of the European Union is the common market, the single market without barriers. And the idea can be traced back economically to David Ricardo, who elaborated 200 years ago already that trade between nations leads to growing wealth of those nations if there are no barriers between those nations. If you enlarge the markets, the benefit is for both parties, for both states. And that's the basic idea of this free trade agreement. And it's also here the case. At the heart of all those free trade agreements is the reduction of tariffs and of quotas. That's the main aspect. And we can see in today's policy with the Trump administration, what the rise of tariffs caused to the worldwide economy. There are a lot of repercussions if you raise the tariffs. So the goods and the services, those are the two objects which are the main aspects. The European Union, we have some more objects of those freedoms, free labor, for example, also intellectual property aspects, but we will focus mainly on the goods and the services. So the basic idea now of the MERCOSUR agreement is the reduction of tariffs of almost 90%, and by that increasing the economic exchange between South America and the European Union. If we go look technically a little bit closer, this MERCOSUR agreement has two parts called interim agreement one and a comprehensive partnership agreement. And this interim agreement, that's that on which will enter in force in 1 month. It covers exclusively trade issues and is ratified by the European Union. The European Union has the power to negotiate under public international law for all European member states such trade agreements. However, it has not the sole power to negotiate political cooperation. That's why the comprehensive agreement needs also to be ratified by all member states. But concerning the trade as such, it is sufficient to have this interim agreement. As you know, the Parliament voted not in favor for this agreement because it voted to review it by the European Court of Justice. However, Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Union, enacted it, and it's the possibility for such international agreements between states that it's the domain of the executive and not of the legislator to enact it in the outside sphere. So it will enter into force, and it is legally backed by the power of the executive of the European Union. It's the very core of most of those free trade agreements is the principle of national treatment. What does it mean? National treatment means that the parties from the MERCOSUR are treated like nationals within the European Union. That means it's a principle of equality. It's a principle of non-discrimination. That's at the heart of those free trade agreements, and also in here in the chapter 2 concerning the trade in goods. That means the parties in Latin America, the MERCOSUR, the states are profiting from the same liberties and freedoms like the economic actors in the European Union. That's the principle. Of course, there are some exceptions, and we'll come to that. But this is an important principle of those free trade agreements, also of the MERCOSUR. And the exceptions are now coming here with the protective clauses, and we will see that in more detail by Mariana, who will continue the discussion.
Yeah, hi everyone. Also from me, a warm welcome. Thank you for your interest in the presentations. So I will now proceed with the exceptions to the general mentions that Professor Bella just did, because the agreement also includes protective clauses. So those are the exceptions to this general treating them the parties at the same level. And there are different protective clauses in the agreement. I will provide some examples of those clauses now to you. There you can also see how it's phrased. And I will first talk about the protective clause, which basically gives the EU Commission the right to temporarily Such certain products can at the outset only be imported in certain quantities. So for example, for beef, there's a quota of 99,000 tons per year planned, which corresponds to less than 2% of the European production, but half of the amount of the imports currently imported from the MERCOSUR region. And for the first time, that's actually a bilateral safeguard clause, which also covers imports under tariff rate quotas. Tariff rate quotas are kind of a two-tiered approach where a tariff quota applies to, like a lower tariff rate to a specific good. And if that threshold is reached, after that, there is basically there's over the threshold then doesn't comply to the high. So you have a certain threshold where you can import the goods, and after that the higher tariffs apply to the products. And some import quotas are now lower than for the products that we now have, for example, for sugar and poultry also. And it's also important to notice that the EU MERCOSUR doesn't supersede other agreements that we have. For example, the EU deforestation regulation. So the products that are part of the deforestation regulation are still that still applies. So the EU MERCOSUR agreement will not lead to the fact that the products that are part of the deforestation regulations now have lower limits. So it's kind of still the highest standard of the agreement that applies. Then we also have a so-called rebalancing mechanism that allows a party to seek compensation if a measure applied by the other party substantially impairs any benefit accruing to it. And basically that refers to loss and especially in the context of environmental regulations. It's meant to compensate for the economic impact of a trading partner's legislation or practice, even, and that's important to remember, even if they do not violate the provisions of the agreement. So this mechanism was added in response to a request by the EU MERCOSUR member states. And it's argued that it may lead to the EU refraining from implementing or coming up with new legislation on environmental provisions because they don't want to be subject to those compensation requests. So, this will be an interesting question and to see further where this is going. If this rebalancing mechanism can be used by the MERCOSUR countries to pressure the EU to refrain from enacting or enforcing legislation. And it's also mentioned that it will be interesting with the CBAM, with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, if this will kind of challenge the operation of this mechanism. So these are all the interesting future questions that we will have to deal with. And yes, with that, I give it over to Rebecca.
Well, hello everyone. Today I will briefly present the main legal issues, criticisms, and overall evaluation of the EU MERCOSUR agreement. Let me start with the main legal concerns and critique. One major issue relates to the import of products that may have been produced using pesticides and antibiotics that are banned in the European Union. This raises concerns about consumer protection, food safety, but also fair competition. In addition, trade unions have criticized the agreement for the insufficient implementation of International Labour Organization standards, especially regarding workers' rights and social protections. Another important legal question concerns the structure of the agreement itself. Critiques argue that splitting the agreement into two parts could circumvent the ratification rights of the national parliaments. This may conflict with EU primary law, especially Article 218 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. as well as fundamental principles such as conferral, institutional balance, but also sincere cooperation. Finally, there's an ongoing debate about whether the agreement could lead to a weakening of the environmental standards, especially in sensitive regions such as the Amazon rainforest region. That way it's easier. Well, let me now turn to the economic implications for the MERCOSUR countries. On the positive side, the agreement offers improved access to the EU market, which could lead to export growth, but also diversification. It may also attract direct foreign investment, promote integration into global value chains, and support technology transfer, but also regulatory improvements. Moreover, it allows MERCOSUR countries to diversify their geopolitical partnerships while reducing dependence on limited trading partners. However, there are also disadvantages. Local industries may face increased competition from European countries, and the benefits may not evenly be distributed within these countries. There are also concerns about environmental pressures, but also regulatory asymmetries and the risk of limited industrial upgrading. Looking at European Union law, there are also clear advantages. The agreement contributes to the diversification of supply chains, for example, by reducing dependence on countries like China, especially regarding raw materials such as lithium. It is expected to increase EU exports to Latin America significantly. Some people say potentially by up to 39%. Certain industries in Europe, especially in Germany, are likely to benefit, including mechanical engineering, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, but also the automotive sector. On the downside, however, European farmers face competitive disadvantages, and there are continued concerns about environmental risk, especially in those sensitive regions regarding deforestation in the Amazon region. Finally, let me conclude with a balanced overall evaluation of the agreement. Well, for both sides, the agreement represents an important step. It introduces binding environmental but also social standards, which have been a first for an EU trade agreement with South America. Geopolitically, it can help counterbalance China's growing influence in the region and be like a signal against increasing global protectionism. Economically, the regions are contemporary. Latin America offers a very young and growing population, and Europe provides a stable but aging economic area. So overall, the agreement creates both winners and losers, depending on the perspective, but also the sector. We can say its success will ultimately depend on effective implementation, the enforcement of standards, but also political acceptance. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, I would say go on and then we have the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I believe my presentation is just after here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for the speakers which preceded me. I have a particular personal experience with the human negotiation because I worked negotiated as a negotiator between 2019 and 2023. I was there at one, in a particular period when we had even reached the political conclusion of the agreement, which unfortunately then had to be reopened, etc. But anyway, and I think all the information which was provided was absolutely very relevant. Clearly, the why we think it is important, this agreement, is that it is basically a geopolitical, in this geopolitical situation, it is really absolutely unprecedented agreement, which is going to link basically 450 citizens with almost 300 million citizens. MERCOSUR, it's an important trade bloc. It is like the sixth world economy. And so it's considered really, really important. However, the negotiation, as you can see from this chart, has been extremely difficult, extremely lengthy, because, as I said, it is unprecedented that you bring in a bloc of, as the European Union, with a very heterogeneous and imperfect free trade area, which is the MERCOSUR. So MERCOSUR, which is made of 4 members, it's extremely, you always had, first of all, it is composed of a giant, Brazil, Argentina, which is a big country, and 2 small countries, Paraguay and Uruguay. And if you look at the back at the history, you always had one of the MERCOSUR country which was left or right. There was a misalignment which made it that the political contrast between the MERCOSUR countries was stronger than the incentive to conclude an agreement. And the same is true within the European Union, when you have a very big players like Germany or I think even Italy or Spain, who have constantly pushed for this negotiation to be concluded. And on the other hand, other countries, especially agricultural producers like France, Poland, or Ireland, who always push for this agreement not to take place because they are terrified by the potential negative impact which could have on their farmers. So you look at this timeline, it started in 1999. It had the different phases until basically now, where we are now, after the 4 MERCOSUR countries have ratified it. It will enter into force actually on the 1st of May, so exactly 1 month from now. A little summary to recall why the MERCOSUR agreement is important. It is the world's largest free trade agreement. Basically, it will it's the biggest agreement ever negotiated on the planet. It represents about a quarter of world GDP. And basically, it links 2 blocks of countries which generate over 100 billion yearly trade. And also, it moves a lot of foreign direct investment. So about 400 billion stock of foreign direct investment that basically are moved either from MERCOSUR to the European Union or from European Union to MERCOSUR. And of course, the context is very interesting because you have, on the one hand, China. If you look at this chart, basically China has been, over the last 20 years, become the main trade partner of MERCOSUR. So it has increased the market share. The colors are not fantastic, but if you look at China is basically the red, you can see that basically the market share of China has been increasing, and one of the EU has been decreasing, and the US more or less stable over the years. So basically, we saw with all, there was clearly an awareness that unless the European Union would close this agreement with MERCOSUR now, there was pressure, for example, for China to negotiate an agreement with Uruguay or Brazil, with the possible breakout of MERCOSUR. There was also the US have concluded an agreement with Argentina, which is totally incompatible with the agreement with MERCOSUR. So if we would not have this agreement into force very fast, that would have been opened another big risk that this agreement would not could not enter into force. As was already said, the architecture of this agreement is quite peculiar. It's not new because it has been used for, in the case of Chile, for example. So you have on the one hand, on the right hand, what it is known as being exclusive EU competence, trade. The European Court of Justice basically has, in the famous Singapore judgment, basically they've stated that trade policy is exclusive competence of the European Union, which means the European Union does not need the member state to ratify it. And on that basis, basically there was this famous split, putting on the one hand only the trade part exclusive competence, and on the other hand the partnership agreement, which includes the trade, the ITA, so the Interim Agreement, but also is much broader because it includes a political chapter and a cooperation chapter. And this is exactly the same architecture which has been tested for Chile. Nonetheless, the European Parliament was so, pushy to try to find any possibility to block the agreement that they have initiated this legal challenge. And one of the 3 points of the legal challenge is the splitting of the agreement. So they consider that, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, you are lawyers, so you probably have your views, but we thought, I mean, our lawyers consider that this is compatible with the EU treaties, but there might be challenges ahead, we will see. We are in completely uncharted territory on many of the provisions of the agreement, like this new mechanism, rebalancing mechanism, for example, it's something which does not exist in any other agreement up until now. Yes, I mean, again, winners or losers. Here again, another scheme. According to the estimate we have made, and I mean, also a little parenthesis. MERCOSUR, look at the tariff schedules of MERCOSUR countries nowadays and compare them to other countries of the rest of the world. Basically, MERCOSUR is the most protected trade bloc in the world, by far. It may be compared to India or Indonesia or some products, but basically the average tariff is over 30% with the sectors which are super heavily protected. You can argue that this is not necessarily very good in terms of trade and or economic for the consumers and not for the industrial sector. So it is that's why it is very, very important, and that's why, according to our estimate, it would lead to tariff savings which are huge, and in particular for the car industry, machinery, chemical, drugs, but also food products. It's much beyond the hard industrial sector. Same applies to public procurement. Now today, the MERCOSUR countries are very protected, so you have basically the threshold are so high that for European companies to win a tender in MERCOSUR is very, very, very difficult. And thanks to this agreement, they will be the two sides parties will liberalize, will lower the threshold considerably, open for competition, which also should be, in theory, according to the economic theory, very good for consumers who will pay less for probably better quality of services. Some people, this agreement has been labeled as cars for cow agreement. So we sell cars, they sell cows. It's a bit simplistic. It's a bit simplistic because it is, I mean, not true. Our agriculture sector, our agri-food sector is going to gain a lot for the reason that I mentioned before. The fact that the MERCOSUR is extremely protected market. So for products like wine, chocolate, olive oil, and many other food preparation, the EU will be able to export to increase the export to Mercosur and vice versa. Another big innovation is the protection of geographical indications. We're talking about Parmigiano Reggiano, etc. I mean, again, these, you know, on each of these subjects, I can spend 1 hour basically to apply. But GIs is another revolution, and that's not only important because our products, European products, and Mercosur products will be protected in the markets, but because we basically have won a battle against the US, who has been and is still lobbying very, very heavily because they don't believe in geographic indications. I mean, it's not part of their DNA. They believe in a generic appellation in trademarks. And we believe that Parmigiano, to produce a genuine product like Parmigiano Reggiano, it can only be produced in Parma. It cannot be produced in Wisconsin. But yeah, I mean, this is an open battle, which was won with this agreement, which was won with the agreement with Chile, with Australia, which was finalized 2 weeks ago, New Zealand, I mean, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a very important gain. Important also because in Latin America, clearly a country which was colonized by the Europeans. What did the Europeans do? Started producing a cheese, calling it Parmigiano Reggiano, which is not. And so this leads a lot to confusion and misleading for consumers. And so we thought, no, we need to put order to this, and we need to defend our GIs. In terms of the Mercosur, I would say, in my view, the biggest gain for Mercosur is the fact that it will force this trade bloc to function properly. Because up until now, it is an imperfect free trade area. And this is the first real trade agreement that they have negotiated, because all the other agreements that Mercosur has negotiated are extremely shallow, superficial, basically not leading to any deep, basically liberalization. So this is the big one, and we force them, because this agreement is not only about the tariffs and non-tariffs, it's about rules, it's about disciplines. So Mercosur better, get their acts together and discipline itself, because they will have to comply with all the many provisions of the agreements, which go from disciplines on critical raw materials to food standards to sanitary and phytosanitary measures. I mean, it's very, very, very substantial and very deep what we have negotiated. For Mercosur, clearly they have a comparative advantage in light industry, so footwear and textile. They should be competitive, and their exports should increase considerably. On critical minerals, we have a would say complementary interest. There are products like lithium or niobium, which are very where we can be found in Mercosur countries, not in the EU. But at the same time, the Mercosur have an interest in having more foreign direct investment to be able to extract these minerals, which, by the way, should also be extracted in line with the sustainability principles which come whenever our EU company go overseas to invest or to get involved in mining. Yes, I mean, according to the studies which have been elaborated in Mercosur or even the European Union, the commercial gain, are going to be considerable also for Mercosur. As I was mentioning before, this is not a hardcore trade agreement only. It comes with very substantive disciplines which go well beyond the tariffs. For the first time, we have an agreement. I mean, it's not the second time. Sorry, after the second time after New Zealand, we have an agreement which has the Paris Agreement as an essential element. What does it mean? that if tomorrow one of the Mercosur countries decides to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, or we observe and consider they are not complying, effectively implementing the provisions of the Paris Agreement, we could basically open a challenge which can lead to the suspension of the agreement. The essential elements of the agreement are usually only those agreements related to human rights, protection of human rights, the whole human rights body. So first time we have also this apply to environmental climate change. We have compulsory animal traceability, which comes with this agreement. And one of the critique which was raised is that, oh yes, of course, but then from tomorrow, European consumer will start eating beef which is produced with hormones and with the pesticides. I mean, notably in Mercosur, use much more pesticide. I mean, this is not true, because in fact the rules, the condition will not change, because any product which comes on the European market, it has to comply with the maximum limit, maximum residual level of pesticides. So yes, we have agreed under heavy pressure of some countries like France to increase the level of audits, the level of controls on the imports of these products, but it will not. I mean, it should not change, because I mean our standards are not changed because we have negotiated this agreement. Simply, you know, the products which are put on the market, if they are not comply with our standards, will not be able to be placed on the market. We have also established cooperation on many other themes, like animal welfare, antimicrobial resistance, which seems, very innocent words, but I mean, this is behind they are very, very important, very, very significant. There are binding commitments to halt deforestation, and this is very important, because one of the factors which had blocked the conclusion of the negotiation before was concern, especially in Brazil, about the impact on the policy on deforestation. So again, if countries, I mean, in Europe, we already deforested, unfortunately, so we cannot redo it. But in Mercosur, there's still room for deforesting, and we hope that is not going to move with this. So if there is an issue, the European Union could challenge Mercosur countries. And of course, the anti-deforestation law will, as you mentioned before, will still apply. And as I mentioned, there will be reinforced audits and controls on the border to comply with the request and concern of some member state in the European Union. Point which was mentioned before, there are safeguards which are built in the agreement, according to which if there are unusual or abnormal increase of the imports, this can bring to a suspension of the tariff liberalization. So they could temporarily suspend the tariff preferences if there are, I mean, really a significant market imbalance in the European Union. Yeah, I mean, the macro context, I think it's important to recall that we have negotiated this agreement while, as I mentioned before, China had overtook the European Union as the main trade partner. It was with this Belt and Road Initiative have been moving very fast to develop ports, roads, finance, I mean, everything, and basically flood the Mercosur country with cheap consumer products, with a big risk that they would displace, of course, the European Union or US or other competitors. Not to forget also the dominance in telecommunication and the push to develop, cables between the continent and China. And the second, would say, point which basically acted as an accelerator for the negotiation to be finalized was the big shift of the US with the Trump administration into very protectionist. Oops.
Yeah. China is.
So I'm sure that somebody is listening here, maybe. Yeah, I mean, again, I would say that the new policy approach of the US was acted as an accelerator, not only to conclude very quickly this MERCOSUR agreement, but since basically we started second Trump administration, the European Union managed to close a negotiation with Indonesia, with India, with Australia, MERCOSUR. I mean, it's not nothing. And of course, with the US, the MERCOSUR and Latin America is basically a battlefield. We were competing with them as well. And I mean, that's why I think it is quite noteworthy that the European Union managed to close these deals, because with this MERCOSUR agreement, basically the European Union has agreements with all Latin American countries, with the exception of Bolivia and Venezuela. So we have the whole continent covered, something which other competitors don't. Yeah, I mean, it is a little bit more in detail. Recalling some of the notion about the strategic dimension of this agreement, the counterweight to China and USA. I mean, I'm not gonna read all this, but I mean, this is quite important. Points that I mentioned before, that with this we basically cover 90% of the Latin American GDP, and that even if China, its presence is increasing. Very important that we consider this agreement important in terms of value chains in different sectors, different areas. I mean, in terms of the green transition, clearly the fact that this agreement opens the way to access to critical raw materials like lithium and copper on a non-discriminatory basis. I mean, doesn't mean that we have a guarantee to access these materials, but we have a guarantee that if Argentina, Brazil decides to start discriminating against EU companies, we can basically challenge them legally, and we can. So it should act as a disincentive for these anti-competitive practices. So we basically have a set of rules and disciplines which level the play. Which establish a level playing field. Clearly, also we looked at MERCOSUR as allies. In theory, I mean, they are all countries which are democratic countries, which have, normally high human rights standards, and so that's why we look at the MERCOSUR bloc as a very important partner, also to coordinate our policies in the multilateral sphere. Now, what are the main challenges? The ratification of the European Parliament. I mean, basically, what happened was that once the agreement was, the legal text was signed in January in Paraguay, and then the next step was there is a common understanding between the European Parliament and the Commission and the Council that before the agreement, this agreement, the ITA had to go to the European Parliament for a vote. But there is a possibility to provisionally apply the agreement before the consent of the European Parliament in terms of the ITA, or before the ratification of Parliament of the national parliament for the partnership agreement. The common practice was that we would wait for the European Parliament consent before provisional application. And I think for the first time, basically, there was a consensus between Mrs. von der Leyen, the European Parliament, the Council, that we could not wait up to 2 years for the Court of Justice, because it was happening in the meantime that the European Parliament decided to send this agreement to the Court of Justice for a legal opinion on three main aspects. One is the split, one is the rebalancing mechanism, and one is the precautionary principle. All these three, we look at this as more or less as an excuse, as a dilatory tactic by those who oppose the agreement. And so I think there was a consensus that we could not wait 2 years to apply provision in the agreement. Otherwise, for all the reasons that I mentioned, I mean, we would reopen a Pandora box. So maybe we'll never be able to close the agreement anytime soon. So, having said that, once this legal opinion is available, the European Parliament will have to vote the consent. We assume and we hope that it will do. Otherwise, this is again another very interesting legal case for you. There is clearly a very strong, still is a very strong agricultural resistance by, in particular, France, Hungary, Ireland, who voted against this agreement in the Council. And I open a parenthesis. I mean, all the predictions of according to the analysis studies which we have commissioned, which we have developed internally, which we have also outsourced, the impact on the agriculture of the agriculture sector in Europe is not going to be so dramatic and so massive. It will be some adjustment, but will not be a catastrophe. That's what other agriculture producers say. And I can also mention the story of the CETA agreement between European Union and Canada. Basically, the same situation appeared where you had France and other countries who were basically saying that this was going to be a disaster for the beef sector. It was going to destroy French agriculture, and exactly the opposite came true. Because if you look at the CETA few years after implementation, the opposite happened. Actually, European Union increased agriculture exports to Canada and not vice versa. I don't think it's going to happen in the case of Mercosur, but just to give you a sense of proportion of things that I think there is an over exaggeration. Deforestation, again, a big concern by NGOs, and I think this is clearly justified. But what we think is that we are better off with an agreement than without an agreement. You know, if we have an agreement, this contains some legal binding commitment for Brazil, for Argentina, not to the forest, for these countries to comply with the Paris Agreement. If we had no agreement, we would have no leverage whatsoever. The argument that the more beef production would lead to more deforestation, yes and no. I mean, by far the largest importer of beef from Mercosur is China. And China, when they import beef, they probably don't ask many questions of what is going to happen on the forest. And B, I think it was mentioned before that the amount of beef which is represented by this quota is around 1% of EU consumption. So it's relatively minimum, and it should not be. In fact, there should be, according to our estimate, there will not a very important increase of quantities of the beef that the European Union will import. But it will move from outside the quota into quota. So the gainers are likely to be those operators which basically are in charge of managing the trade operation, should not lead to an increase in volume. Yes, clearly one other big challenge is that the norms and standards which we have in European Union and the difference between the EU standards and the MERCOSUR standards are quite large. So there will have to be some sort of convergence, but we will see how long and what will be the impact. In terms of next steps, I mentioned before, 1 month exactly from now, we will have the provision application. We will have to wait for the Court of Justice judgment for the European Parliament to ratify it. And in the parallel, then the agreement will have to go to all member state parliament to be ratified. I mean the partnership agreement, which englobes the ETA, so the trade chapter, but also the cooperation and political pillars. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, I was reflecting on what could be the impact on Chile of this MERCOSUR agreement. And I would say, if on the one hand, I think that once it is implemented, it should lead to some sort of a convergence of regulatory alignment of the standards and norms between the EU and MERCOSUR. And not only EU MERCOSUR, but all the Latin American continent, because as you know, as I mentioned before, with very small exception, all Latin American countries have an agreement in place with MERCOSUR. It should lead to, it could have potential positive benefits for trade between Chile and Brazil, or Chile, Argentina, because we would, go towards a more of a certain convergence of the standards of these norms. So harmonization for the Latin American continent could be an implicit positive impact. Yeah, I mean, it is also true that if you look at Chile, there might be a pressure for investment to flow into Brazil or Argentina rather than to Chile. We'll see. I mean, the European Union is still the largest foreign direct investor in Chile, in MERCOSUR, in whole Latin America. So I would say there is still a lot of margin for new investment, which is going to be generated by this massive trade and regulatory opening. We will see. The jury is out, but I think it's probably good news that we have more trade going to take place on the basis of rules and norms rather than the law of the jungle. And that's, I conclude. That's it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we open the session for questions. If any, don't be shy. Oh,
I would have a question actually. Why is excellent insights? Why is Chile not part of the MERCOSUR? What's the historic reason?
Yeah.
Because I wonder, is there someone can give me the answer?
I think, I mean, personally, because I think traditionally Chile is much more liberal economy, and was much more interested into the Pacific Alliance, perhaps, or CTPP, which is considered much more liberal. In MERCOSUR, it was looked at as a dinosaur.
Okay.
Now we'll see how.
So it profit indirectly, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would maybe add one other idea, because I had the same question until I looked at the map of Latin America, because all the MERCOSUR countries are on the east side, I think, the east, or not yet. So like the shipping line go directly to here. So for Chile, for example, it will always mean more exchange to the Panama Canal or well outside of the continent. So I think this could be also like a point why Chile is a member.
Yeah, clearly it's not, yeah. I think not Pacific for sure.
For questions.
Again, thank you so much for you and of course for the amazing presentation. I have a practical question. There is established already in the agreement or the framework of the agreement. What would be the dispute settlement mechanisms in case of disputes for not complying with the Commitment of Sustainability, for example, or it would be like through the WTO or something like that?
No, there is a built-in dispute settlement mechanism with different steps, which can basically lead to until the end to the arbitration, etc. And you can look at there's a whole chapter. Right, so do you think of it?
You also from my side for the presentation. On the part of the agreement that still has to be ratified by the member states, I was wondering one thing, and I am not a lawyer, so does this still or ratification, which still has to happen, imply that if, for example, only one member state ratifies this part of the agreement, is this member state allowed to implement the measures? Okay, so we have to wait for the 27 of them to do that. Okay, but imagine that already happened. This specific part contemplated the aspect of cooperation, and you showed also a sub-part on research and development. Do you happen to have more information about how research and development is operationalized? I come from Heidelberg University, so I would be interested in there are any expected outcomes for scientific cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert either, but what I know is that in this chapter, in the cooperation chapter, you have an enhanced cooperation. What you have foreseen enhanced cooperation between MERCOSUR and European Union, so more opportunity to talk and discuss. And I would imagine that, for example, you have big what is it?
See Horizon Europe.
Europe program like this will be certainly amplified, and there will be many more probably new instruments which are going to be put in place for supporting this cooperation between the European Union and MERCOSUR university research centers. I mean, this will come. I mean, it's already taking place in a way, but it will be, if you have a solid legal basis, it will be much faster. There is also a large program of cooperation which is going to be mobilized to support the implementation of the agreement. We recognize that MERCOSUR countries don't have the same level of development of the European Union, and there will be challenges. So it will be, on the one hand, help MERCOSUR countries to, let's say, deal with the adjustment of the automotive sector, but also support more cooperation on scientific, on environment or climate or agriculture, agri-food, the standard norms. I mean, you name it. I mean, will be much bigger, I think.
As you can see from the history of the European Union, it started with this economic trade union and the single market, and then the other aspects grew up steadily, the academic integration, political integration. So I think that's the first important step.
I have a question. It's more like a hypothetical example, because you mentioned about the tariffs that European wines would be benefit from when the MERCOSUR agreement, MERCOSUR EU agreement takes place. Brazil is one of the biggest wine markets for Chilean winery wines in general. What advice would you give, for instance, a Chilean winery that exports to Brazil, when in Brazil the European wines are going to be benefited more? Should they be worried? Should they be changing their strategy? What are your recommendations, so to say?
I would be a bit worried. But I think, in my view, the answer is that they should, Chilean wines have peculiar characteristics which cannot be found in European wines. So they should find and develop a differentiation elements based on quantity, or quality, sorry, hopefully even on price. I mean, I don't know how Chilean wines compare in terms of price, but I mean, I would say the qualitative feature is what should be the main most important element for Chilean wines to keep a market which they already have. So you will have probably newcomers wines, but yes, I mean there will be some readjustments. Yeah.
If I can give a recommendation, in Europe we have an amazingly increasing market in alcohol-free drinks. We had a great success in the beer market when the beer producers managed to have the same taste of the alcohol-free beer like the alcoholic beer. And that's lacking, that's missing at the moment concerning wine. So if you would be able to produce alcohol-free wine, then it would be a huge export dimension, because we can see the consumer behavior is changing in this aspect. And I think all wineries in Europe, or some of them at least, have seen that signal now and are trying to move in that direction. But it's apparently difficult to maintain the taste when extracting the alcohol. So, and that would be perhaps a good.
Great information.
Let's start at that.
Thank you. We plan to monitor and enforce all the non-deforestation constraints and all that, because it's not a little naive to know.
I mean, it's a good question. We will not set up a special new mechanism. We will have to rely on the, basically on reporting and monitoring of international organizations and NGOs. Clearly, we have a research center in the European Union which already monitors deforestation with satellite Copernicus. We have our own, satellite system. So that system is already working, and we're already monitoring actively what's happening. And this can give some early, early warnings. But clearly, we are not on the ground. We have an embassy in Brazil, but we will not be able to monitor directly. So we will have to, I would say, to rely a lot on some mechanisms that we have, like this ISPRA and Copernicus Center, and listen and be in very close contact with the NGOs who are on the ground, who know what's happening, monitoring, and also international organizations which regularly produce reports on the situation of how figures have numbers on how things are performed.
Why not in it?
And it's clearly not set up yet, but for that, AI can be a helpful tool in order to measure that, because it can collect more data at the time, and then they also use that for tracking wildlife, which they couldn't track before on that level. So if we create the awareness, maybe we can use that to actually have the technical stuff to comply with those regulations.
Exactly, yeah. And if I may add here too, the deforestation regulation, which is in force in Europe, has a decentralized approach. That means it obliges the importers of the products of wood, for example, or beef, to certify that it's not coming from a deforested area. And
then with the means of Copernicus, with the geolocalizing tools and AI, they can certify that. Currently, it's technically possible. So it's no centralized administration. It's rather decentralized. But
because of course the aim of the European Union is to stop deforestation and wherever the products are headed to. But I would be careful because usually when you try to enforce these measures and these certifications or whatever, from so to say an economic point of view, I can imagine like two markets in Brazil happening. One of expensive premium beef going to Europe and booming, and that creating money to deforestate, or how it is said, to export more beef to other countries that are not, subject to these constraints. And so in general, and I'm not an expert in public policy, I think these well-intended measures many times end up badly.
absolutely, that's the
The
danger of
incentive here is too big to the deforestation.
But the commitment built, the binding commitment built in the agreement goes beyond to what to the trade between and Brazil. It's
Okay, that's good.
no, it's deforestation in general. Chile and Brazil cannot deforest, but cannot be in breach of the commitment in the Paris Agreement. Cannot deforest, otherwise we can basically open suspend the agreement. This should act as a incentive, but having said that, is already complicated the situation in Brazil. I think the latest figures are going down, but if there is a change in parliament, and they can have a reverse of this situation. So it's complicated, but at least we have mechanisms, we have measures in place, and we have institutions, because we can, thanks to this agreement, we will have fora, we will have committees which oblige the two parties to be in a room and to basically talk on the basis of data, figures, numbers, with a concept which can be very serious.
And there are also growing opportunities for creating new markets which include benefits to nature. Like, for example, the EU last summer introduced the roadmap toward nature credits, and that leaves opportunities for example, creating a system where there will be payments based on keeping nature healthy and like keeping the forest alive, so that they can trade that with like carbon credits and stuff. So that's a very interesting field right now, is to elaborate the legal design opportunities, how we can intertwine and web those systems so that actually creates new opportunities for conserving the forests.
Just a short question. I saw, thank you for the presentation, by the way. I saw in your presentation, Andreas, that you mentioned something about some investment on the rail market, rail infrastructure, and also imports. Do you have something like concrete, or is it just an idea? Just some,
I didn't understand completely
about the rail market or rail investment in the rail tracks or ports. I saw one in your presentation that there will be maybe some investments from Europe, but I would like to know if there is something concrete or just an idea.
It is an assumption which we have made, because we know that at the moment the markets in MERCOSUR are so protected that the fact that we increasingly have to liberalize and lower the pressure, etc., will certainly open the way to more investment in ports, infrastructures. That's what we expect. That's also before any negotiations, the European Union undertake a sustainability impact assessment, so which basically try to assess all the consequences, the impact of the agreement, and another study done internally. It's an economic analysis of the benefits. In all these assessment analysis, we have basically they've been made some assumptions which lead to the prediction that there will be more investments, but hard, almost impossible to quantify. It can be